How you doing, everyone? Welcome back. Well, as I referenced in my last video regarding, the Department of War invading Chicago, well, apparently Donald Trump actually thinks that it was woke politics in 1947. Actually, 1949 is when the name, 1947 is when it no longer became the Department of War. When it ceased being the Department of War, in 1949 is when it became the Department of Defense. Okay? But yeah, that was all woke politics back then, right? Because, Harry Truman and the Red Scare, you've got Joe McCarthy in the Senate, trying to out everybody as a communist, right? 40s and 50s, yeah. McCarthy was a good guy, wasn't he? So anyway, Truman, yeah, being the woke guy that he was, dropping atomic bombs on Japan and all that, being the guy that ultimately brought an end to the Second World War. Whether or not the bombs were necessary, that's a discussion for another time, and one that I'm not going to get into. But Donald Trump wants to call it the Department of War. First of all, he needs an act of Congress to do that, because it took an act of Congress to name it to give it the name of Department of Defense. This was actually a law, the National Security Act of 1947, which was amended in 1949. Okay? Now, the 1947 National Security Act, it abolished the Department of War. No more Department of War. Okay? What it did is it created the Department of the Army and the Department of the Navy. And now the Air Force was its own branch. Now, the Air Force started off as being part of the Army. They split from the Army, became their own branch. So you also had a Department of the Air Force. Okay? So you've got departments of Army, Navy, Air Force. And for those of you who may know a little bit about the military, but not a lot, may not understand this, you may wonder why I'm skipping over the Marine Corps. I'm not. They are actually the Department of the Navy. They are a division of the Navy. They will only admit that on the day of the Army-Navy football game, but it's true. They're the Department of the Navy. So, what happened in 1947 when when this happened, right? Now, the Secretary of Defense, that position was created. It wasn't really created. The Secretary of War became the Secretary of Defense. Okay? So, that position was renamed Secretary of Defense, even though it wasn't the Department of Defense yet. So, one secretary. And he was in charge of a department that was now known as the National Military Establishment. The National Military Establishment. And then in 1949, the National Military Establishment became the Department of Defense. Now, was this woke politics in the 1940s? Post-World War II wokeness? No, it really wasn't. I don't normally have notes in front of me, but I do for this one. What was the purpose of the rebranding? It wasn't just a rebranding. All right? It was not just a rebranding. What was the purpose? One thing that we learned from World War II is that the rivalry between the Army and the Navy had them competing for resources, right? So a single Secretary of Defense could run the Department of Defense more efficiently, coordinate strategies, budgets, and procurement. Okay? This way you don't have, the infighting between the branches. I mean, it still exists, but not. These days it's just more of a fun little banter, right? I kind of made a little bit of a joke that maybe some people didn't get, when I kind of took a shot at the Marines a little bit ago, how they don't like to admit that they're Department of the Navy. Another joke that goes around is there are really only two branches of the military, and that's the Army and the Navy, because the Air Force is a corporation and the Marine Corps is a cult. So, stuff like that. I mean, jokes like that get thrown around all the time, right? And that kind of rivalry is fun, right? But when it affects the mission, well, we can't have those rivalries getting in the way, can we? So, unified command and control, right? To make our military more efficient. That is why the National Security Act was passed. And another reason is because what happened after World War II? The Cold War. Now, I'm old enough to remember the last part of the Cold War, right? I was born during the Cold War, and I'm old enough to remember when it ended. Actually, some of you older millennials may also remember that. Younger millennials, you may not. Gen Z, you're not going to remember it at all because it was over before you were born. Okay? But yeah, younger millennials are probably not going to remember it. Older millennials might. But Gen X, yeah, we're definitely going to remember that. So, Cold War comes to an end. So now, we are at a standoff with the Soviet Union, right? Both the United States and the Soviet Union are nuclear powers. They are the two global superpowers. We've got the space race, we've got everything else going on. The space race doesn't come around until late 50s, early 60s, but still, all of this is going on, right? NATO just came into existence, okay? So we're more concerned with working with our allies in Europe and Canada. I'm sorry, I did not intentionally overlook Canada. I love Canada. We are working closely with our allies in Canada and Europe. At this point in time, NATO is not nearly as big as it is now, I think. What did we have? We had Norway and Great Britain, UK, whatever you want to call yourselves. Sorry, I'm not trying to be offensive here. But we had the British, we had the French, we had the Norwegians, we had the Canadians, the West Germans. Was Iceland originally part of Norway? I don't remember. But Denmark, were you originally part of it? I don't remember that without looking it up. But yeah, we had the United States, Canada, and some Western European countries. And it has since expanded. Right? It is now a large organization to the point that, Vladimir Putin said that he invaded Ukraine in order to prevent them from joining NATO, but in doing so, they pushed Finland into NATO, because he doesn't want NATO on Russia's border. Never mind, there were a couple of small NATO countries already on his border. And Finland has a huge border with Russia, is now in NATO. Anyway, I digress. NATO. We're working with our NATO allies because we know what a threat the Soviets are. All right. So with the Soviet threat, that they were not. They may have been our allies in World War II, but they were not our friends, if that makes sense. Okay? The enemy of my enemy is not my friend, but I will accept his help in defeating my enemy, kind of thing. So, yeah. Cold War strategy. We want to deter the Soviet Union. We need to be ready in case things pop off. And keep in mind, the CIA and the National Security Agency were also created at this time, right? Under the same act. So, intelligence gathering, and using that as a basis for our national security, using that to drive our national security. That's why it was rebranded as the Department of Defense. Not only that, but just, yes, it was somewhat the optics, because Department of War, it's like, do we want a department that is very specifically designated for war and war alone, when really we just finished the sequel to the War to End All Wars, right? World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars, and we had just finished watching the sequel to that movie. So, defense. Yeah, it is somewhat the optics of, hey, look, we're not going to focus on actually just fighting wars. We're going to focus on actually defending the United States. So, yeah, it was a little bit optics, but it certainly wasn't woke politics of the 1940s. Okay? Not to say that there weren't woke politics in the 1940s, before FDR died. I mean, he was one of the most woke presidents we had ever had. 1930s and 40s were a very woke period, as that term is used by the right wing today. In a lot of ways, woke wouldn't even become a thing until, that most of us would know about until decades later. But that's another topic for another time. But yeah, Donald Trump cannot unilaterally change the name from Department of Defense to Department of War. It does require an act of Congress. And you might say, what's in a name? And I get that. But at the same time, he's doing it for optics, to say that, hey, look, we are ready for a fight. We are looking for a fight. We want to start a war. President of peace. Yeah, right. He's declaring war on his own cities, but he's the president of peace. Sure. I'll see you next time.